Blood always smells like copper and regret. Morgan knew this better than anyone in County General's. She spent her nights taping up bar fights and hiding the callous hands that had once stitched torn arteries under heavy mortar fire. No one suspected a thing until that night. The fluorescent lights did not hum. They buzzed with a frantic, dying insect frequency that worked its way into your teeth if you listened long enough. Morgan stood at the triage desk, staring at the flashing cursor on her monitor, letting the sound vibrate through her jaw. The air smelled, as it always did at this hour, of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and the sour sweat of anxious people. She peeled a piece of medical tape from the edge of the desk, her thumbnail scraping against the faux wood laminate. Her hands were unremarkable short, unpolished nails, faded knuckles. They looked perfectly suited to entering insurance details and handing out plastic cups of ice chips. "Hey, Morgan," a voice broke the low murmur of the waiting room. It was Dr. Corbin, a second-year resident who still wore his stethoscope around his neck like a badge of honor. His scrubs were too stiff. He hadn't washed them enough times to soften the heavy cotton. Got a laceration in bed from a motor vehicle accident. But the guy walked in himself. "Thinks he's fine. I'm going to suture." Morgan's voice was flat, gravelly from a night of disuse. "You want the lidocaine with epinephrine?" Yeah, good call. Faces bleed a lot." Morgan didn't smile. She simply nodded and turned toward the supply closet. She knew faces bled a lot. She knew exactly how much blood a human body held, roughly 5 liters, and she knew precisely what it looked like when 3 of those liters soaked into the sandy floor of a Humvee. She pushed the thought down, a well-practiced reflex, like swallowing a pill. Bed 4 was a mess of tangled sheets and the sharp reek of cheap whiskey. The patient, a man in his 40s with a violently bruised steering wheel mark across his chest, was arguing with a nurse tech. He had a deep gash over his left eyebrow. The blood had dried into a crusty, dark maroon trail down his cheek, but fresh crimson welled up every time he shouted, "I just need to go home." "Man," the patient slurred, trying to swing his legs over the side of the bed. "Sir, you need to lie back," Dr. Corbin said, stepping into the curtained enclosure. He held up a needle, projecting what he thought was medical authority. It only made the drunk man angrier. "Don't come near me with that," the man spat. Morgan stepped into the space. She didn't announce her presence. She simply moved to the head of the bed, her rubber-soled clogs silent on the linoleum. She didn't ask the man to lie down. She didn't use the high-pitched, placating voice they taught in nursing school. She placed one hand flat on his sternum, just a resting weight, not a push, but a boundary. "You're going to lie back," Morgan said. Her tone was completely devoid of emotion. It was an order stripped of anger or pleading, the voice of someone who expected absolute compliance. The man blinked. The aggression faltered as he looked up at her tired, gray eyes and felt the firm, immovable weight of her palm against his chest. Slowly, he slid back onto the mattress, hold his head. Dr. Corbin muttered to Morgan, looking relieved. Morgan put her thumbs on the man's cheekbones. Her fingers splayed into his greasy hair, keeping his skull rigid. As Dr. Corbin began to inject the local anesthetic, his hand shook slightly. The needle slipped, angling wrong. Morgan's fingers shifted a fraction of an inch, pressing a specific pressure point near the temple and subtly redirecting the angle of the man's face so the needle found the right tissue without Dr. Corbin even realizing he had been corrected. "Good," Morgan murmured, though it wasn't clear whether she was speaking to the patient or the doctor. When it was over, She washed her hands in the small sink, the water scalding hot. She scrubbed it until her skin was raw, watching the pink-tinged suds circle the drain. There was no adrenaline here, just the slow, grinding machinery of civilian trauma. Broken arm, a bruised rib, a bad choice. It was safe. It was maddening. She dried her hands on rough brown paper towels and walked back to the break room. She wanted silence, but the television in the corner was muttering the early morning news. The smell of someone's microwaved lasagna from hours earlier lingered in the stale air. Morgan poured a cup of sludge from the bottom of the coffee pot and took a sip. It was bitter, burnt, and cold. Perfect. She sat in a plastic chair staring at the blank wall, consciously ignoring the phantom smell of cordite and diesel exhaust that sometimes crept into the back of her throat when she was too tired to block it out. Just the remaining hours of her shift stood between her and the quiet anonymity she craved. The shift change brought a harsh, unforgiving daylight to the hospital. It streamed through the large glass doors of the lobby, illuminating dust motes and the scuffed floor polish. Morgan pushed open the heavy locker room door, her canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. She had changed out of her scrubs into worn denim jeans and a heavy dark green canvas jacket. She looked like 100 other exhausted night shift workers shuffling out into the cold morning. Her neck was stiff, a dull ache radiating down her spine. She just wanted her bed. She wanted the blackout curtains and the heavy hum of her bedroom fan. Because the east exit was blocked by a scaffolding crew, she was forced to walk through the main waiting area. It was mostly empty, a few people sleeping across the vinyl chairs, an elderly woman staring blankly at a daytime talk show. And then she saw them. They didn't belong here. Even before her eyes registered their faces, her nervous system recognized the anomaly. 3 men stood near the vending machines, but they weren't buying anything. They stood with that unnatural, relaxed stillness that comes only from years of carrying heavy plates of Kevlar. Civilian clothes, flannel, dark jeans, work boots, but the fabric draped over them awkwardly, failing to hide the rigid posture, the way their eyes continuously scanned the exits, the subtle, unconscious spacing between them, far enough apart to avoid presenting a single target, close enough to cover one another. Morgan stopped walking. Her grip on the straps of her backpack tightened until her knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. Her stomach dropped sharply, a cold wave of nausea flooding through her. She felt an immediate, irrational urge to turn around and sprint back into to hide in the supply closet among the sterile gauze and saline bags. They hadn't seen her yet. She could keep walking, keep her head down. Then the tallest of the 3 shifted his weight. He had a thick, silver-streaked beard and a cane leaning against his left leg, a heavy brace supporting his knee. Harlan. Next to him was a younger man with severe burn scars, pulling the skin of his neck taut beneath his collar. Silas. And standing in front, staring directly at the hallway she had just emerged from, was a broad-shouldered man with a sharp, unforgiving jawline and eyes as dark as wet slate. Gideon. Morgan's breathing hitched. The hospital sounds, the beeping monitors, the squeaking wheels of a gurney, the low chatter of nurses faded into a dull, underwater rushing in her ears. Gideon's head snapped toward her. The eye contact hit her like a physical blow. He didn't smile. None of them did. The atmosphere in the corner of the waiting room suddenly felt dense. Oxygen-starved. Morgan forced her legs to move. She didn't walk toward them with the grace of a reunited comrade. She walked toward them like a cornered animal, her jaw set, her eyes darting to the glass doors leading to the parking lot. She stopped 5 feet away. The scent of them hit her cold morning air, old leather, and a faint sharp trace of gun oil that probably never really washed out. "What are you doing here?" Morgan asked. Her voice wasn't warm. It was barely above a whisper, harsh and defensive. Gideon looked at her. He took in her tired eyes, her plain clothes, the defensive fold of her arms across her chest. "Hard woman to find, Doc," Gideon said. His voice was gravel, rough and deep. He didn't call her Morgan. He didn't call her nurse. "I'm not a doc anymore. I'm a nurse. And I didn't want to be found," she snapped, glancing. "It's not just a thank you," Gideon said, taking a slow step closer. He reached into his leather jacket. Morgan flinched a microscopic, involuntary twitch of her shoulders. Gideon paused, recognizing the movement for what it was, the hypervigilance that never really turned off. He moved his hand slower, pulling out a small, worn manila envelope. "We didn't come here to drag you back," Gideon said quietly, his dark eyes softening just a fraction. "We came because the unit got disbanded and they were going to throw away the records." He held out the envelope. The paper was creased, the edges soft from being carried in a pocket for a long time. "What is this?" Morgan asked, her voice cracking. She didn't reach for it. "It's the after-action report from the extraction," Gideon said. "The real one, not the redacted version they filed. The one that says exactly what you did." Morgan stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. Her chest felt tight, the air trapped in her lungs. She had spent years trying to forget the extraction. She had scrubbed her hands raw 1,000 times, trying to wash away the memory of the men she couldn't save that night. "I don't want it," she whispered, taking a step back. "I don't want to remember." "You don't have to read it," Silas said gently. "But you need to own it. You saved us, Doc. We're standing here breathing because of you. We couldn't let you just disappear into a hospital and pretend it never happened." Morgan looked up, her vision blurring as the harsh fluorescent lights fractured through sudden tears she refused to let fall. She looked at Harlan's ruined leg, at Silas's scarred neck, at the heavy, tired weight on Gideon's shoulders. They were damaged. They were broken, just like her. Slowly, her hand shaking, she reached out and took the envelope. The paper felt heavy, loaded with ghosts. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice barely audible, but her fingers closed tightly around the envelope, holding it against her chest like both a shield and a chain. Dust motes danced in the narrow beam of gray light piercing the gap in her bedroom curtains. Morgan sat on the edge of her mattress, staring blankly at the uneven floorboards. She hadn't bothered to take off her boots. Heavy rubber-soled hospital clogs had been replaced hours ago by scuffed leather combat boots she told everyone she had bought at a surplus store. Her apartment smelled of old lavender detergent and stale cooking grease from the diner downstairs. Cold air seeped through the poorly sealed window panes, biting at her ankles. She hadn't turned the radiator on. Cold kept you awake. Cold kept you sharp. In her lap, resting against the worn, damp denim of her jeans, sat the manila envelope. Fingers trembling violently, she traced the creased edge of the cheap paper. It felt brittle, rough against her calloused skin. Gideon had probably carried it across state lines, tucked inside the leather of his jacket, letting his own body heat warp the edges. She wanted to drop it into the metal trash bin beside her desk and strike a match. Fire cleanses everything. Fire turns history into ash. Instead, she slid her thumb under the glued flap, hesitating as the aged adhesive resisted. Paper tore with a sharp, dry rasp that sounded entirely too loud in the quiet room. Inside rested a thick stack of standard military issue forms, held together by a rusted staple at the top corner. Faded ink formed blocky, impersonal letters, but the stamped red words, classified eyes, only bled aggressively through the thin sheets. Morgan stared at the first page. She deliberately unfocused her eyes, refusing to read the words, but the rigid format of the document was enough. Suddenly, she wasn't sitting in her chilly apartment anymore. Heat slammed into her chest, heavy, suffocating, and reeking of sulfur. Fine, chalky dessert dust coated her throat, clinging instantly to her sweat-soaked skin. She tasted battery acid, copper, and raw adrenaline. Get on the gun. A voice screamed, shredding her eardrums. It was Harlan. His voice cracked with a high-pitched panic she had never heard from him before, a sound that violated everything she knew about the giant. Stoic man. Deafening staccato pops echoed inside her skull, vibrations rattling her teeth. It was an insurgent ambush in a nameless, sun-baked ravine. Plumes of sand kicked up where bullets chewed the dirt inches from her face. The nauseating smell of burning rubber and melted plastic from the destroyed transport vehicle filled her nose, mixing heavily with the sharp tang of fresh blood. She remembered the brutal, tearing drag of the heavy canvas straps digging into her shoulders as she pulled Harlan behind the smoking shell of the shattered truck. His leg was a ruined, unrecognizable mess of jagged white bone and dark, rapidly pooling crimson tissue. Desperation made her hands slick. She had shoved her fingers directly into the torn muscle, hunting blindly for the slippery, pulsing tube of the femoral artery. Memory expanded, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. She remembered the suffocating pressure of the rotor wash when the medevac chopper finally crested the rocky ridge. Sand whipped her face like tiny needles, blinding her, but she hadn't closed her eyes. She couldn't. If she blinked, Harlan would bleed out. The deafening thud of the helicopter blades vibrated deep in her chest cavity, syncing in time with her racing heartbeat. Silas had been screaming from the stretcher next to them, the smell of burnt flesh rising off his neck, while Gideon laid down suppressive fire, his rifle barrel glowing white-hot in the fading desert light. Morgan blinked hard, her breath hitching as she forced the bedroom walls to snap back into focus. She gasped, her lungs pulling in the cool, lavender-scented air of her apartment. Desperate to expel the phantom heat of the canyon dot, her hands were gripping the edges of the report so tightly the paper was tearing under her thumbs. Breathing in slow, measured counts of 4, she forced her jaw to unclench. She was safe. She was sitting in a city. The ravine was thousands of miles away, buried under years of civilian life. But the paper in her hands was a physical tether, wrapping tightly around her neck and dragging her back to the dirt. Scanning the second page, her eyes caught helplessly on a specific paragraph. It detailed her actions with clinical detachment. Medic held direct manual pressure on severed femoral artery for nearly an hour under sustained enemy fire. Refused direct order to abandon position and fall back to secondary extraction point. Tears hot, shameful, and entirely unwanted spilled over her lower lashes. She scrubbed them away violently with the rough canvas of her jacket sleeve, leaving a painful red smear across her cheekbone. She wasn't a hero. She had stayed because Harlan was screaming, and if she let go of his leg, he would be dead in under 2 minutes. She couldn't stand the thought of zipping up another body bag, couldn't bear the crushing guilt of being the one who walked away unharmed. It was selfishness. It was stubborn, ugly, animal desperation. Brass called it valor. She threw the report onto the rumpled duvet. It slid, coming to rest against her flat pillow. Stripping off her heavy jacket, She walked into the tiny bathroom and twisted the shower handle all the way to the cold side. Ice water hammered against the cracked tiles. She stepped under the spray in her clothes, letting the freezing water shock her system. Her heavy cotton t-shirt clung to her ribs, dragging her down. She stood completely still as the water pounded her shoulders, trying to wash away the invisible grit deeply embedded in her pores. She watched the water swirl down the rusted drain, expecting it to run pink with blood, just like it did in her nightmares. But it was clear, clean. The realization felt like a bitter betrayal. She had survived, and the only evidence left of that day was locked in a manila envelope on her bed and in the ruined bodies of the men who had tracked her down. She slid down the wet tile wall, pulling her knees tightly to her chest, and let the cold water drown out the sound of her own ragged breathing. Neon light from the diner sign across the street buzzed angrily, casting jagged red shadows through her rainy window pane. Morgan had slept fitfully for only. Gideon looked up from his cup, his dark, impenetrable eyes locked onto hers across the room, immediately reading the flight response stiffening her posture. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply lifted his coffee mug slightly in her direction, a silent acknowledgement, a challenge, an invitation. Letting the heavy glass door swing shut behind her, Morgan walked forward. Her wet boots squeaked loudly against the sticky checkerboard linoleum. She stopped at the edge of their booth, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "You guys are completely terrible at disappearing," she said. Her voice sounded raspy, entirely stripped of its usual guarded professional neutrality. "Harlan wanted pie," Silas murmured, not looking up from his plate of half-eaten eggs and greasy hash browns. The aggressive burn scars pulling at his neck looked marginally less severe in the dim, forgiving yellow light of the diner booth. "Cherry. They never have cherry. It's a federal crime," Harlan grunted, shifting his braced leg with a wince he actively tried to hide. He looked up at her, his withered face softening into an expression that was raw and painfully unguarded. "Sit down, Doc." Morgan slid into the booth next to Gideon. She didn't bother correcting Harlan about the title. The cheap vinyl squealed under her weight. Gideon pushed a thick, clean mug toward her and poured black coffee from a dented metal carafe. Steam curled up from the dark, bitter liquid. She wrapped both hands around the hot porcelain, letting the intense heat seep into her freezing fingers, grounding her firmly in the physical sensation. Across the diner, a tired waitress holding a stack of ceramic plates bumped her hip hard against a table corner. The plates slipped from her grip, shattering against the hard linoleum with a sharp, violent crack. In less than a second, four bodies reacted with terrifying synchronization. Harlan's hand darted beneath his heavy jacket. Silas flinched, dropping his center of gravity